On February 24th of 2022, Russia launched an invasion of Ukraine under the guise of a special military operation. In reality, this was an all-out war against its neighbor, whom it wished to bring back into the old Soviet-era fold. Ukraine, however, had no desire to be Putin's puppet, and the war for Ukraine was on. Yet from the very start, it seemed as if Russia did everything it could to not win the war. Does this mean that Ukraine is actually winning, though? The initial Russian offensive played out much as Western observers had expected it would, at least for the first few hours. Large missile and standoff weapon attacks against Ukrainian military facilities, troop formations, radar and communication nodes. A missile and aerial blitzkrieg descended upon Ukraine, which fielded a military a fraction the size of Russia. And yet, keen-eyed observers could tell, even through the fog of war, that something was not quite right with the Russian offensive. When the United States and allies launched Desert Storm in 1991, they were facing one of the world's largest armies protected by one of the world's most sophisticated air defense networks. In order to eliminate Iraq's ability to fight, the very first thing that the US and its allies did was destroy Iraq's air defense and command and control networks with an aerial blitzkrieg of cruise missiles and air attacks. Within 48 hours, Iraq's formidable Soviet-built air defense network was in tatters, and friendly aircraft ruled the skies, allowing them to devastate Iraqi ground forces. Yet, in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which was expected to follow a similar doctrine, this did not appear to be happening. While Russia did strike against Ukraine radar and air defense sites, these strikes were very limited in scope compared to the actual capabilities of the Russian air and missile forces. In fact, it seemed as if Russia wasn't taking the war very seriously, or wasn't taking Ukraine's defenses and will to fight very seriously, or was displaying a staggering amount of strategic ineptitude, or perhaps a lack of tactical capabilities. It seems as if the truth lies with a mix of all of the above. It's unfair to compare modern Russian capabilities to even those of the US in 1991. For starters, the US had the help of many allies, and American equipment, training, and doctrine are simply superior. US investment in smart weapons far outstrips that of Russia, as does its investment in targeting pods for aircraft, special mission airframes, and tracking and surveillance capabilities. Yet, despite the disparity in capabilities, Russia, at least on paper, should have been able to launch an overwhelming and effective counter-force strike against Ukraine that would have been crippling to its ability to defend itself. It became very apparent very quickly that Russia was not devoting a large amount of its combat air power to the mission. It also seemed to be launching only a limited number of strikes with its stockpile of smart munitions, a stockpile that has always been significantly limited in size. When 2 planes fell out of the sky during the first 2 days of the invasion due to maintenance issues, the West started to get the idea of why large amounts of Russia's combat air power might not have been dedicated to the fight. While unconfirmed, there's a possibility that Russia's maintenance and logistics simply couldn't afford to support a large percentage of its combat air power at the same time. This, as we've come to find out, would be in line with Russia's doctrine of bluffing the West with the size and capabilities of its military. However, the truth also likely involves a significant amount of complacency on Russia's behalf and underestimating Ukraine's ability and will to fight. The first 3 days of the war saw a lightning assault by Russia's elite paratroopers on airfields around Kyiv. Within 48 hours, the assaults had been defeated by Ukrainian forces, and Russia's most elite troops were killed or captured. The assault was immediately puzzling to Western observers, who noted that there seemed to be the goal of establishing an air bridge to reinforce these assaults. Ground forces attacking south from Belarus might have been meant to reinforce these air assaults, but they were quickly mired down by determined Ukrainian defenders. Reinforcements were critical for the Russian air assaults because by their nature airborne or air assault forces are light infantry with no heavy vehicle support. At best, these forces can count on light infantry fighting vehicles and in some militaries on light tanks. While air assaults are great for surprising the enemy and seizing territory behind the front lines, they are incredibly vulnerable to rapid reaction forces which can easily overwhelm them, just like the Allies found out in Operation Market Garden during World War II. Now it seems as if Russia stumbled right into its own market garden with equally disastrous results. Russia had completely overestimated its ability to move forces from Belarus to the outskirts of Kyiv in time to reinforce the air assaults, even without any significant enemy resistance, and it would have been foolish to expect anything but heavy and determined resistance. Russian logistics are incredibly poorly suited for supporting operations far from railroads, through which Russia ships most of its supplies. With approximately half the logistic support for each unit that a comparable American unit would enjoy, Russia simply couldn't have advanced fast enough to support the air assaults. Next, Russia failed to neutralize Ukrainian air defenses around the Kyiv area, putting support aircraft in serious risk. Multiple transport aircraft meant to quickly reinforce the assaults were downed by Ukrainian air defenses, and a tragic loss of life for the Russians. The greatest failure, however, which echoed across the entire conflict, was the massive intelligence failure on Russia's behalf on Ukrainian capabilities and will to fight. Before the conflict, President Vladimir Putin had granted his intelligence apparatus millions of dollars meant to conduct operations inside Ukraine to determine the feasibility of an invasion. This money included funds to bribe local and military officials for either information or to facilitate an invasion. There's evidence that this happened to an extent. The roads to Kherson, for example, had been heavily mined as the Russian invasion was launched. And yet, when Russian troops got there, the roads had been cleared of all mines. The discovery prompted Ukrainian President Zelensky to fire multiple high-level officials. It has become clear as the conflict has evolved that Putin's intelligence apparatus didn't just fail in its mission, but it might have pocketed large amounts of the money given to them to carry it out, while feeding him false assurances that the Ukrainian people wouldn't put up much resistance. This is in line with what we know about the state of corruption in the Russian military and government. But evidence for this also comes from the fact that multiple high-ranking intelligence officials were jailed shortly after the invasion when it became clear Ukraine wasn't capitulating. It's perhaps this intelligence failure that could explain why Russia seemed to launch such a sloppy invasion with such low investment of long-range precision striking power. It's also likely why Russia made the incredibly poor decision of launching an air assault operation against Kyiv without having ground forces ready for immediate reinforcement. As the war developed into a grind, Putin maintained pressure on the Ukrainian capital with the hope of seizing Kyiv, killing Zelensky, and ending the war by installing a puppet government. However, this is where Russia was foiled both from within and without. Russia's advance into Kyiv soon became a massive traffic jam, reaching a whopping 40 miles long. But vehicles weren't simply stalled out due to traffic. Many had, in fact, suffered numerous maintenance or supply issues and weren't operable anymore. The infamous Kyiv convoy would show the world how thoroughly corrupt and inept the Russian military was, with evidence of cheap tires being used on multi-million-dollar vehicles. The money for proper tires having been naturally skimmed off the top by the unit commanders. These tires, mainly sourced from China and not rated for the size of the vehicles they were being installed on, soon went flat on muddy Ukrainian roads or simply wore out, stranding dozens of vehicles and creating massive bottlenecks. Simple logistics, however, were also to blame, with Russia proving it could no longer support a major advance deep into enemy territory. Once away from the railheads, Russian logistics depended solely on trucks. As we mentioned before, Russia has approximately half the number of trucks per unit that a comparable American unit would have. The further toward Kyiv that Russian forces moved, the longer the round trip between supply depots and deployed forces grew, inevitably slowing down the advance to a crawl and then finally bringing it to a standstill. The Ukrainians quickly identified this glaring vulnerability in Russian doctrine and made them suffer dearly for it. Ukrainian air and ground forces no longer attacked tanks or infantry fighting vehicles, instead ignored them and focused on destroying Russian trucks. This put even more pressure on an already weak logistics network which would inevitably collapse. As a general withdrawal was announced, many Russian vehicles were simply abandoned, perfectly operational, but without any gas. Russian troops also suffered from a lack of supplies, with many resorting to shooting dogs or cats or simply looting as they had no food. The retreat from Kyiv was Ukraine's first major victory, though truthfully it was more of a self-inflicted defeat than a Ukrainian win. However, the war in the east raged on, and here Russia was making slow but incremental gains. Yet, here too, Russian doctrine ensured that its military was not successful, as it should be against an inferior force. By the time of the Russian invasion, Ukraine's military had been completely transformed. In 2014, Ukraine fielded an unwieldy military still stuck in its Soviet roots. However, after the Russian annexation of Crimea, the United States sent hundreds of personnel to train Ukrainian forces to fight and operate like a Western military. The result would be a Ukrainian military so transformed that it caught Russia completely by surprise. By comparison, Russia's military is very top-down oriented. Orders come from above, and junior personnel have little to no room for interpretation, even in the midst of an evolving combat environment. Russia's lack of a strong non-commissioned officer corps also means that Russian units lack discipline and the professional control provided by NCOs, making them large but very unwieldy. The two factors combined make for a military that's akin to a very clumsy juggernaut. By comparison, Ukraine's forces encourage decision-making by junior officers and enjoy a disciplined NCO corps. While not as well developed as a Western military, the difference is staggering. with Ukrainian units showing an incredible degree of initiative and flexibility compared to Russian forces. The rigid inflexibility of Russian doctrine led directly to many defeats in its campaign for Ukraine, but none quite as high-profile as the utter disaster Russian forces experienced attempting a river crossing at Bilohorivka. When the first crossing was shelled by Ukrainian forces, the Russians simply attempted it again, at the exact same place. Predictably, they were once more decimated by Ukrainian artillery. That didn't stop them from attempting to cross the river at the exact same place multiple more times, all meeting with the exact same disaster. The crossings were an exercise in madness, yielding the exact same result each time. But Russian troops had no choice but to proceed with the same plan drawn up by some senior military leader far from the front. It's estimated that Russia lost as much as an entire battalion tactical group's worth of equipment during the attempts. But this river crossing disaster has played out across eastern Ukraine over and over again, with Russian forces showing a crippling deficiency in both command and doctrine. Despite this and similar disasters, the sheer weight of Russian forces continued to push the Ukrainian defenders westward, with small incremental gains until the stunning Ukrainian counteroffensive on September 6th. Planned in cooperation with the U.S. senior military leaders, Ukraine has now recaptured enough territory to send Russian forces in the north into a general retreat. It's the first major counteroffensive of the Ukraine war. And through a combination of brilliant deception, real-time intelligence courtesy of the US, and sheer guts and determination, Ukrainian forces have delivered a stunning defeat to Russia that nobody saw coming on February 24th. But the question remains, is Ukraine winning the war? Tracking Russian and Ukrainian losses is difficult because both sides have a vested interest in keeping those figures secret. However, open-source reporting has led to some estimates that are likely within the ballpark of the true figure. Russia is estimated to have lost right around 2,000 tanks, with many of them captured and put into use by Ukrainian forces. Estimates of captured tanks after the latest offensive alone is somewhere around 24, enough for Ukraine to equip 2 tank companies. If true, this would be about 66% of Russia's modern tank forces, not counting the 20,000 hunks of junk that Russia keeps in storage as leftovers from the Cold War. Although we have confirmation of T-62s being sent into combat in Ukraine, hinting that Russia's tank problems are reaching critical levels. It's estimated that Russia has also lost around 4,500 infantry fighting vehicles, or around 34% of its total force. 1,300 artillery of self-propelled and traditional type have also been captured, abandoned, or destroyed, or around 23% of Russia's total. 250 of Russia's most modern aircraft have also been downed, though this is only around 18% of Russia's total. Most important of all, though, after-tank losses are Russia's estimated 217,000 casualties, 54,000 of which are estimated as KIA. This is a quarter of the entire Russian armed forces. But that figure is deceiving because it's counting all military personnel. With an estimated 300,000 ground combat forces, this means that a significant number of its combat personnel are either dead or wounded. Losses aren't Russia's only problem, as it's widely reported that Russian morale is at all-time lows. Almost from the start of combat operations, Russian troops were exhibiting low morale, with one tank unit going so far as to run their commander's legs over as retaliation for the high casualties they took. Now, Russian morale appears to be reaching critical lows, especially in the north, where the total number of POWs taken is unknown, but some estimate around 3,000. Perhaps the greatest sign of Russia's weakness, however, is the fact that according to reports, Russia has ceased sending new units into Ukraine. After the defeat in the Kharkiv Oblast, Russia has begun a major nationwide recruitment effort to replenish its combat losses. While not yet announcing mobilization, a national recruitment campaign is a sign that Russia recognizes it cannot generate the manpower needed to secure its objectives in Ukraine. On the home front, though, the Russian economy is starting to show signs of serious weakening due to sanctions. Western sanctions have been criticized even amongst the West as ineffective. Yet this was only because Russia has used significant currency reserves to artificially prop up its economy. Those reserves are slowly running out, and the reduction in energy that Russia supplies to Europe, both by self-bans of Russian energy and by Russia deliberately trying to pressure Europe by cutting off gas flows, means that Russia's biggest moneymaker is now drying up. With energy sales propping up the entire Russian economy, the sharp decrease in sales to Europe has sent Russia seeking alternative buyers, and those buyers are now setting prices themselves. China and India are both buying up cheap Russian energy at prices they dictate, and then selling it for a profit internationally. By comparison, Ukraine is slowly but surely gaining the Western support it needed from the start. Western countries are now mulling over the decision to supply Ukraine with heavy equipment such as tanks and aircraft. The US has approved the training of Ukrainian pilots on the F-16 and F-15, and within 6 to 8 months it's all but assured that Ukraine will be flying Western fighters. Germany's mulling over a decision to equip Ukraine with Leopard battle tanks, and increasing calls from within the US might lead to an approval of equipping Ukraine with the mighty Abrams. So, is Ukraine really winning the war? The answer is both yes and no. Wars aren't won until they're won, and any number of things could dramatically change the situation for Ukraine. As some in the West experience Ukrainian fatigue, the amount of support for the nation could begin to dwindle. Europe is already set to experience a harsh winter due to energy crunches after being cut off from Russian supplies, and this could dramatically swing European opinion against continued support for Ukraine. Yet the United States remains steadfast in its commitment to Ukraine and seems set to supply the nation with even more advanced equipment. While Europe may and has been faltering in its own backyard, the support of the US alone may be enough to shift the tide of the war in Ukraine's favor. Russia, however, remains a significantly large, if clumsy and inept, military power and has not announced a general mobilization. Even a general mobilization is at this point unlikely to win the war for Russia, as it would take nearly a year to mobilize, train, and equip fresh forces, time that Russia simply does not have. At every turn, Ukraine has been underestimated, yet there's very real fear of overestimating Ukraine's ability to succeed. Its offensive in the east continues to be successful even as this video is being made, but that offensive succeeded in large part due to surprise. It's unlikely such operational surprise can be achieved again, and this means the war is inevitably going to come to a slugfest in which Russia is the heavyweight. Only continued and vastly increased support from the West can see Ukraine push Russia back to its borders, and as of now, Ukraine isn't necessarily winning, but it's a long way from losing. Russia's been fighting for months in a war that they thought would be over in a matter of weeks. This has led to Vladimir Putin making some pretty alarming statements, including mentioning the use of nuclear weapons to improve Russia's position in the conflict. However, Russia has recently been backing down as its forces regroup to begin the next stage of their offensive against the Ukrainian people. Putin thought he could easily take Ukraine by force using conventional means, but he has clearly failed. This is both good and bad news. It's good news because Ukrainian troops are holding their own against Russia. It's bad news because it means Putin is preparing a new war plan, one that could lead to the end of the world as we know it. Putin's new plan to win consists of several different components. Surprisingly, some of them have nothing to do with conventional fighting. The mad dictator of Russia plans to defeat Ukraine using unconventional tactics, and you might be an unwilling part of his plan. One main component of Putin's agenda as of right now is to wait. It might seem that he doesn't want the war to go on any longer, but this is partly an illusion. Putin is banking on Western nations waning in their support for Ukraine. Without European countries and the United States providing Ukraine with weapons and supplies, eventually Russian forces will be victorious. But would the nations that support Ukraine ever let this happen? The answer to this question might make you a bit uncomfortable. Right now, many countries, including the United States and much of Europe, are headed toward a financial crisis. There are several reasons for this, but the war in Ukraine and Russia's decision to cut off oil and gas exports, while also forcing other OPEC countries to reduce the amount of fossil fuels they're exporting, are some of the reasons economies around the world are in decline. These are not the only factors that are leading to inflation and economic slowdowns, but they are playing a major role. Putin sees the EU and the US's struggle to maintain financial stability as a waiting game. He's banking on Russia being able to endure long enough in the fight with Ukraine to see the NATO countries suffer economic collapse. If this happens, aid to Ukraine will likely slow or completely come to a halt. At least this is what Putin is planning on. But it isn't just the leaders and economies of the Western world that Putin believes he can wait out, it's you as well. Putin and other military leaders in Russia have said that the West is weak and will eventually either grow tired of the war or their attention will shift to something else. The scary thing is, he might be right. The way that many people around the world consume news today is by following the trends and what is fed to them via social media and algorithms. If people in other countries stop paying attention and let their support of Ukraine falter, there's a real chance that politicians will no longer feel the pressure to provide aid and support to the nation. Vladimir Putin has made it clear he's willing to wage his war for as long as it takes, and he's betting that support for Ukraine will wane long before his desire to capture the country does. And to be fair, that's probably true. As times become harder on families in the United States and Europe due to increasing energy prices, inflation, and economic slowdown, people will start worrying more about putting food on their table and paying their bills than supporting Ukraine. The ability to wait out the rest of the world until Ukraine is starved of help and support is one key component of Putin's plan to win the war. And if the last several months have been any indication, this might actually come to pass, as many NATO countries already have problems brewing at home. In the UK, Prime Minister Boris Johnson stepped down and was replaced by Liz Truss, who has now resigned after 44 days of serving as Prime Minister. In France, President Emmanuel Macron's party lost the majority in parliament. And in the United States, the midterm elections were predictably turbulent. There's nothing wrong with new officials being elected to government. However, these drastic changes are coming at a time when the world's economic future looks more dubious than ever. Putin is watching the governments of Western countries scramble to maintain the support of their constituents. Only time will tell whether support for Ukraine wavers due to financial and political problems in the US and Europe. However, the longer Putin and Russian forces can hold out, the more likely it becomes that people living outside the conflict zone will shift their focus to other problems or whatever the next big crisis is. Because let's be honest, there always seems to be a new threat looming just around the corner. Another key component in Russia's plan to win the war is misinformation. Putin and his cronies have used misinformation for decades now to control the country, but when it comes to war, they're taking this tactic to new levels. Using the state-run media, Putin is brainwashing the Russian people by claiming the Western world wants to use cancel culture to erase their identity. He's taken things a step further and even claims that the West wants to censor the Russian people themselves, and he is just fighting for their freedom. In reality, Putin has stripped away the very freedom he's promising his people. The spread of such lies has unified certain extremist groups and Russian citizens who may not have initially thought the war was necessary. However, the manipulation of the truth doesn't stop there. Every day, the people of Russia are told that the special operation is going well, yet it's taking longer than expected. But Putin reassures them that everything is going according to plan and nothing will stop them. To further demonize the enemy, Russian Foreign Affairs Ministry Sergei Lavrov has even used the media to spread misinformation, such as Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky being a Nazi. This is an especially surprising tactic as Zelensky is Jewish. The misinformation being spread by Russia to its citizens and onto the internet for conspiracy theorists around the world to see is extremely dangerous. It's also all part of Russia's plan to make sure the public remains on their side in the war against Ukraine. Russia obviously knows they are a major supplier of oil and natural gas to much of Europe, especially Germany. Therefore, cutting off this supply of fossil fuels has already caused many Europeans to suffer at the hands of astronomical utility prices. The reality is that many people in Europe will not be able to pay their bills and could have their electricity or heat shut off in the coming months. As the Northern Hemisphere heads into winter, the reduced amount of fossil fuels coming into the EU from Russia is going to cause huge problems, and Putin has built this into his plan to win the war. Multiple high-level officials in the Kremlin have bragged that EU residents will be feeling the impact of these sanctions more than Russia will. The plan is basically to hold the citizens of the EU hostage by taking away oil and gas, which will cause prices to skyrocket and support for Ukraine to diminish. Russia also hopes that this will result in civil unrest and force European governments to focus more on what's happening at home than aiding Ukraine in their fight against Russia. They're also betting that as people in Europe suffer, the governments will lift certain sanctions on Russia. All of these things would help Russia win the war in the end. It's become abundantly clear that relying heavily on Russia for energy resources was a huge mistake, a mistake Putin is now exploiting. But it's not just in Europe that Russia's hoarding of natural resources is being felt. Even in the United States, gas prices are again on the rise, making many Americans extremely upset. Russia believes that as oil prices increase, NATO countries will be more willing to loosen restrictions to bring oil and gas prices down to keep their citizens happy. Unfortunately, this would allow Russia to do even more damage in Ukraine. Putin is leveraging a Western world's reliance on fossil fuels to force governments to give him what he wants. As a people, citizens in the United States and Europe might accept these rising costs and maintain their support for Ukraine for a time, but when families can't afford to heat their homes or the increased gas prices become too much of an inconvenience, pressure will be put on elected officials to do something by making a deal with Russia. Again, this is another part of Russia's plan to win the war. If Russia can cause enough problems and discomfort for the average person in Europe and the US, the lifelines that are being provided to Ukraine could diminish, and at that point all Putin would have to do is continue sending troops across the border and wait until Ukrainian forces ran out of supplies. Russia's also not too worried about waiting out sanctions and fighting a prolonged war because they believe one particular ally will always have their back, a country that is an economic powerhouse and more than willing to buy their oil and gas. China has the second largest economy in the world, and although they do not support the war, they're more than happy to buy resources and goods from Russia. A main part of Putin's plan going forward is relying on allies to continue buying Russian oil and gas. Russia believes that China will help compensate for any economic losses that are caused by the sanctions placed on them by the United Nations and NATO. This reliance on China is especially important for Russia, as it can secure technology and other goods necessary to keep its war machine going. China is more than willing to purchase Russian oil at a huge discount and help boost its own economy and output. However, China has made it clear that it'll take no part in the war, and it will not openly provide Russia with weapons or military vehicles. Russia needs China to keep buying its exports to fund the war, but they're also in desperate need of military equipment as well, something China so far has refused to supply. Russia's artillery, tanks, and weapons are mostly from the Cold War era, and supplies are running low. The sanctions have definitely hurt Russia's production capabilities, but Putin refuses to admit this as it would show weakness. Instead, most Russian media outlets spread lies that China and Russia are happily working together to keep Russia's economy going while they manufacture more weapons and military vehicles to fight the war against Ukraine. This brings us to Russia's more militaristic strategies to win the war going forward. Fighting has slowed recently, but Putin claims it's all part of the plan. He reassures the people of Russia a new strategy is being put in place. It's not clear exactly what the strategy is, likely because the military leaders in Russia don't really have one, but Russia's next phase of the attack will include more soldiers. Russia has now conscripted over 300,000 soldiers to fight in Ukraine. Originally, they thought their initial force would be enough to decimate the enemy, but this clearly wasn't true. At the beginning of the war, Putin decided this mass mobilization of Russia's army wasn't necessary. Many in the Kremlin disagreed with the decision, but Putin didn't listen. In his new plan, Putin is pivoting to what was recommended to him by his advisors months ago and sending more troops to Ukraine. Putin won't admit it, but ever since he's ordered the conscription of more troops, over 200,000 Russians have fled the country. It's clear not everyone believes the nonsense Putin and the Russian leadership are spewing. At this point, even if something happened to Vladimir Putin, such as an assassination or getting eaten by a Russian brown bear, the war would likely continue. This is because the Kremlin has invested so much into the war and believes that they have the right to take Ukraine and incorporate it back into the motherland. Young men and women will continue to be drafted into the Russian army without a choice as part of Russia's plan to defeat Ukraine. However, Russia has also been threatening to use a weapon so terrible it could lead to World War III. And unfortunately for the rest of us, this too is part of their plan to win the war. Russia's made it clear that using nukes is not off the table when it comes to winning the war in Ukraine. For now, Putin has only talked about using tactical nukes, which are around 1 kiloton and have a blast radius of about 50 meters. Anyone within half a mile of the explosion would likely receive a large dose of radiation, resulting in a 50% mortality rate. This is much smaller than strategic nukes, which can be over 1,000 times more powerful. However, the use of tactical nukes would change the course of the war completely and could result in the end of the world. In Russia's plan, it seems most probable that tactical nukes would be used if Russian forces were pushed back by Ukrainian soldiers. In this scenario, a tactical nuke could be launched from an artillery cannon or via short-range missiles from a battleship or submarine. The fallout wouldn't be nearly as large as that of a strategic nuke, but the surrounding area would become irradiated. The bigger problem with this part of Russia's plan is that it would provoke NATO to take immediate action. The United States and Europe cannot and will not allow Putin to use a nuke unpunished. There would need to be some kind of response, and although Putin knows this, he still believes that Western countries don't have the backbone to stand up to Russia. This might be true, as most of the world does not want a nuclear war to break out, but using nuclear weapons would most likely result in some kind of militaristic response by NATO. Although NATO might not actually need to retaliate, because if Russia did use a tactical nuke in Ukraine, almost every country on the planet would turn against them, including China. China has already made it clear that they adhere to a strict no-first-use nuclear doctrine, which means nukes should only be used for defensive purposes. This is not how Russia plans to use them. It's unclear if Russia would be willing to suffer the consequences and become a global pariah just to keep Ukrainian forces from pushing them out of their territory, but Putin may not have a choice. The main and most important part of Putin's plan is to win the war at all costs by using any means necessary. The reason for this is that if Russia does not win, Putin will fall from power and will most likely be executed for his failures. Obviously, this is the last thing he wants, which makes Vladimir Putin the most dangerous man in the world. There are ways that Russia as a country could get out of the war, but Putin would forfeit his life under these circumstances. Therefore, the only part of Putin's plan that cannot be changed is that he must win. As Russia reassesses its approach to the war, Putin will make sure that no matter what actions are taken, it makes him look strong in the eyes of the Russian people. This is why, rather than try to negotiate, Russia is doubling down on fighting by deploying more troops and trying to weaken the countries supplying Ukraine with weapons and resources. Even if the war in Ukraine becomes unwinnable, Russia will likely fight to the last man, because if they don't, everyone in the Kremlin right now would either be exiled or put to death. The scariest part about this scenario is that it's reminiscent of the spot German leadership was in during World War I. Kaiser Wilhelm II and his advisors all realized the war was unwinnable, but they continued to order their troops to fight for years. This was because they all understood that if Germany lost, their administration would be overthrown and a revolution would take hold of the country. As we now know from history, this is exactly what happened. Putin and his allies also know that if Russia fails to secure Ukraine, a similar revolution could happen in their country. It might not lead to Nazism, but there would be a shift in power, and Russia could even become a capitalist democracy, something that would be worse than death for some Russian government officials. Putin and Russia's leadership are incredibly dangerous for this very reason. That's why their plan to win the war isn't so much a plan as do whatever it takes to secure victory, even if it means starting a nuclear war. That being said, a part of Russia's plan to win does involve some sort of diplomacy. If Putin could secure enough military victories and concessions from Ukraine to spin his failures as a victory, he might be willing to end the war using diplomatic means. Right now, this doesn't seem likely to happen. However, part of Putin's plan does rely on him being able to negotiate at some point, especially if Ukraine continues to do as well as they have been in the war. In Russia's timeline, if they do not conquer Ukraine for the next year or two, there's a contingency plan. In order for Russia to come to the table for peace talks, some other parts of Russia's plan need to come to fruition first. The most important one is that Europe needs to descend into economic and political chaos, so they stop lending aid to Ukraine. If this does not happen, Russia will not have a strong bargaining position at the table. For Putin, this would be unacceptable. However, if all goes according to plan, Russia will have advanced further into Ukraine, and only a handful of resistance forces will be left to deal with. At that point, Putin could make an argument that Ukraine was all but his and head to the negotiating table to end the fighting. Even if Russia wasn't guaranteed to win, reduced foreign support might cause Ukraine to give in and concede on some of their demands. This could still result in parts of Ukraine, such as Kyiv, remaining independent as long as most of the country becomes the property of Russia. Obviously, this is not the optimal outcome for Ukraine or NATO. However, if economies are in shambles and countries stop sending military supplies to support Ukraine, this might be the best deal they can secure. It's a scary thought, but Russia could theoretically wait out Ukraine and the rest of the world. If they continue to reduce the oil and gas flows being exported from OPEC countries under their influence, a very real global crisis could develop. These are all things Putin is banking on for his plan to come to fruition. However, the leadership of Russia may want to enter negotiations as soon as possible because the massive mobilization of their forces is incredibly unpopular with its citizens. Most join the military when conscripted because they're afraid of what will happen if they refuse. Others flee the country. Overwhelmingly, the Russian people do not want to be forced to fight the war with Ukraine. Right now, using misinformation tactics, Putin can still justify the war as a means to an end that'll protect Russia's way of life and culture. If Ukraine is allowed to join the EU or become allies with the West, then it's only a matter of time before NATO invades Russia and forces everyone to become a capitalist, or so Putin says. After years of fighting, this argument likely won't hold enough weight, which is why Putin might be willing to come to the table as long as he can save face. If Ukraine is still in a strong position to negotiate, Putin will never sit down and try to come to an agreement. This is because it'll lead to his fall from power and likely cost him his life. Most experts agree that at this point, Putin's just trying to strengthen his bargaining position, and eventually he'll come to the table. However, there's still a very real possibility that if Putin feels he'll lose the war, he could enact the most radical part of his plan to defeat the Ukrainians by launching nuclear weapons. It's terrifying, but if Putin had to choose between losing power and obliterating the world through nuclear war, he might just be crazy enough to choose nuclear holocaust. No matter which way you look at it, Putin's plan is a mess. It hinges on a lot of things going right for Russia and a lot of things going wrong for the rest of the world. It's not to say that his plan won't work. There's a very real possibility that people will grow weary of the war, and support for Ukraine will fade. This would be terrible, but the longer the war lasts, the worse things will get due to economic decline and shortages of oil and gas, and the more likely people are to stop caring about Ukraine. So the question now becomes, can Russia outlast Western countries and eventually wear down NATO and Ukraine? As of right now, around 70% of Germans support their country giving aid to Ukraine, even if it means higher energy prices over the next few months. However, it'll be interesting to see what that number will look like if this winter is particularly cold and people can't afford to heat their homes. Around 72% of Americans support providing further military aid to Ukraine, but again, as gas prices increase, this number could become lower, which is what Russia's plan for winning the war is predicated on. Around 58% of Americans have said they think the United States government should support Ukraine for as long as it takes to defeat Russia. Much of the sentiment likely carries over from the Cold War era. However, almost all Americans agree that what Russia is doing is wrong. The problem is that if the world doesn't continue to pay attention to the crisis happening in Ukraine, Putin could literally get away with murder. At the rate things are going, it seems like the war could last for years, and many don't think Russia can maintain its current military push after years of sanctions and the boycotting of Russian goods. This will quickly start to affect the average Russian citizen, and Putin may need to shift his focus on domestic matters as life gets even harder. Currently, he holds too much influence and power for an uprising to be successful, but as military forces and machinery are depleted from the war with Ukraine, Putin may find that his plan to win falls apart, and people of Russia start to hold him accountable for his actions. If we do not want Russia's plan to win the war to succeed, we cannot forget about what's happening. This is what Putin is banking on, and as long as the world stays unified behind Ukraine, there's a chance that Putin will find himself at the mercy of his own angry citizens. February 24, 2022, Russia launched their invasion of Ukraine. The world held its breath and mourned the expected downfall of a much smaller nation of Ukraine, a nation that had just finally set itself on a path to true democracy and began to forge closer ties with the liberal world order of the West. But both Russia and the world severely underestimated the strength of Ukraine and its people, and the Russian invasion went from expected swift victory to a humiliating defeat for Russian forces. The first humiliation for Russia came in the opening days of the war, when its forces attempted to launch a decapitation strike against Kyiv, pushing a large armored force south from Belarus while a helicopter assault secured airfields outside of the Ukrainian capital. Things went wrong almost immediately. Russian forces would famously retreat from Kyiv, signaling that the nation was incapable of quickly winning the war. The battle for the future of Ukraine was officially on. Refocusing to the east of the nation, Russia pushed against Ukrainian defenders with a massive ground assault. It had been expected that Ukrainian defenses would fold like a wet paper towel, similar to their performance in 2014. However, Russia had not taken into account the radical changes in training, equipment, and doctrine that took place after the US and its allies spent 8 years training the Ukrainian military to fight like them. The transformation was incomplete at the onset of the war, but significant enough to cause Russia massive problems. The offensive in the east ground to a crawl, with Russia achieving daily gains measured in dozens of meters. If Russia made one strategic mistake more catastrophic than any other, though, it was fundamentally misunderstanding the nature of the conflict or purposefully ignoring it for political gain. Ukraine made no such mistake, and it knew that the fight was for its life. On day one of the invasion, it launched a massive mobilization and conscription effort, with men of fighting age being banned from leaving the nation. The turnout was so massive that Ukraine actually had to turn volunteers away, as it simply did not have the capability to equip and train so many fresh recruits. The West would soon step in with supplies and even help ship new recruits to bases on NATO territory where they could train without fear of Russian attack. Meanwhile, Russia scrambled to replace the combat losses of its initial roughly 200,000-strong invasion force, a force which Western analysts all knew would never be enough to take the entire nation by force. It soon began to move the battalion tactical groups reserved for NATO deterrence into the country to replace sky-high casualty rates, but even this wouldn't be enough. At this point, any sensible leader would have immediately called for military mobilization, and yet Putin resisted. The reasons are various, but the most prominent one seems to be that Putin knows this war is not very popular, and mobilizing his nation for war might cause political problems large enough for even Putin to be concerned about. As an absolute dictator, Putin keeps Russia democratic in name only, and has worked hard to kill, imprison, or exile any political opposition to his rule. But that doesn't mean his throne is secure, because Putin has to worry about enemies not just without, but within. The Russian Duma and military both house dozens of individuals who would love to take Putin's place and may exploit political unrest to unseat him from power. But mobilization also comes at a significant cost to a nation. Switching to a wartime economy means retooling your domestic industry to meet the demands of high-intensity warfare, something that the war in Ukraine has revealed that both Russia and the West have been utterly unprepared for. Stockpiles of everything from precision missiles to artillery shells and even ammunition for individual soldiers has been burned through at a frightening rate in the world's first modern industrialized war. Details remain sketchy, but most sources state that Ukraine was using as many as 6,000 artillery shells per day and Russia 20,000. That means, respectively, Ukraine is burning through 180,000 artillery shells a month and Russia a whopping 600,000. These figures were so alarming for Western observers that recently the United States has begun to rethink its own readiness for a long-term high-intensity conflict against a near-peer rival, such as China. Making new artillery shells necessitates specialized equipment, requiring a total retool of your domestic industry. With manufacturing being largely concentrated in Southeast Asia, the manufacturing base most modern nations enjoyed in the World War II era is largely non-existent, making it even more difficult to retool an economy for high-intensity war. But artillery shells are still relatively simple to produce, which is probably why Russia likes them so much. Replacing sophisticated weapons like precision missiles or fighter aircraft is a different matter altogether. Gone are the days of assembly line workers simply shifting from producing cars to making fighter planes. Nowadays, manufacturing modern equipment requires highly specialized workers and machinery both. A recent U.S. report noted it would simply be impossible to significantly expand U.S. manufacturing capability of modern weapons in the same time frame as World War II. So what you enter the war with is probably all you're going to have unless you have generous friends. But even those friends have their own defense concerns. So while mobilization and retooling of Russia's economy might see it eventually increase production of basic items such as artillery shells, military uniforms, and rifle ammunition, there's simply no way Russia's going to be replacing its stockpile of Iskander ballistic missiles, which is why it's so baffling that it continues to use them against civilian targets while being militarily defeated. Yet Putin has not even announced full mobilization and thus a shift to wartime economy. Instead, he continues to play the war in Ukraine as if it's merely a campaign that Russia's on, as opposed to the high-intensity war that it really is. So the Russian industry remains largely unchanged and unprepared to replace its terrifyingly large consumption of war stocks. Then there's the manpower issue, and well, conscription has never been popular nor produced the best soldiers, but Russia seems to be really scraping the bottom of the barrel here. At first, in order to avoid conscription, Russia called on foreign volunteers, much like Ukraine did with the formation of its own foreign legions. Unlike Ukraine, however, who enjoyed an influx of significant quantities of experienced, professional Western retired or recently separated soldiers, many of them combat veterans, Russia got Syrian soldiers that by some accounts it forced to come to Ukraine and fight. Many of these volunteers have extremist ties and very little, if any, actual formal military training whatsoever. While Ukraine's foreign volunteers largely had the experience to be formed into military units and fit the role, Russia's foreign volunteers were undisciplined, uncoordinated, and impossible to coordinate with the actions of the Russian military. This quickly led to easy defeats of these units and relegation of those volunteer units to cannon fodder or static defense roles. Then there were the Kadyrovites, units sent by Chechen leader and Putin strongman Ramzan Kadyrov. Known for their brutality and crimes against humanity, Russia hoped to deploy these units as shock troops, and on their way to war, they certainly acted the part. They quickly earned the nickname of the TikTok Brigade for their love of posting videos on social media full of bravado while recounting their alleged victories. Then the war caught up with them. Nobody's really heard much from the Kadyrovite-associated social media accounts lately, though propaganda videos of their alleged victories continue to surface from time to time. Meanwhile, Russian forces have been on steady retreat for over a month straight. At last, Putin was forced to accept the truth of the conflict. This would not be over in a matter of months. Kyiv would not capitulate to his authority, and no amount of TikTok videos would overcome Ukraine's superior fighting forces. It was time to admit Russia needed to mobilize for war, and do so quickly, or else the entire operation inside Ukraine would quickly fall apart. The announcement came on the eve of a massively successful Ukrainian counterattack in the northeast of the country that saw even Russia's mighty 1st Guards Tank Army, the unit that was meant to break through the teeth of NATO's best defenses, retreat in such great haste they abandoned most of their equipment. Yet Putin did not believe he had the political capital left to announce a full mobilization and instead enacted a half measure, announcing a partial mobilization. Allegedly, only veterans would be mobilized with the goal of raising 200,000 conscripts. Students, certain professionals, and individuals with no previous military experience would not be mobilized for war. The reality was immediately different because this is Russia, and reports quickly came out of the country of students, young men with no military experience whatsoever, and even old men with medical conditions being called up. The response was immediate, with hundreds of thousands of Russians leaving the country for good, joining an exodus believed to number over 1 million since the start of the war. The official goal was 300,000 conscripts, though unofficial leaks claim that Russia hopes to eventually mobilize as many as 1 million men, a number it might realistically need at this point if it hopes to win in Ukraine. It was soon clear that Russia was taking or dragging into service anyone it could. A 63-year-old former staffer who was diabetic and had cerebral issues was shipped off to a training camp, eventually returning after public outrage. Thousands of students received call-up orders, prompting such outrage that Putin was forced to sign a law confirming that vocational and secondary education students would not be conscripted. The Russian military made multiple promises, with the first already being broken. The next promise was that conscripts would receive several weeks of training at a minimum and adequate equipment before being sent to fight. This almost immediately proved to be false. In one famous case, a military doctor is recorded briefing fresh conscripts. She instructs them to use their own money to buy sleeping bags, sleeping pads, or other supplies, because the military will not provide such things. She also implores them to ask their mothers, wives, and girlfriends to send them tampons to use for bullet wounds, because the military would also not be supplying them with first aid kits.
Тампоны. Тампоны знаете для чего? Нет, кровь останавливается. Пулевое ранение, прям туда вводите и все.
The chaos of mobilization has been well documented. You're probably at least somewhat familiar with what the U.S. recruits face at basic training.
Get your arms up. Sort of like all you're holding is a water bottle. Get it up.
However, Russia is handling its influx of new recruits differently.
Я пытаюсь вам рассказать. Вы не даете, вы орете. Я говорю, вы все военные мужики.
Almost immediately, reports of poor treatment and lack of supplies flooded social media via Telegram. Things such as socks are in such short supply that conscripts are being instructed on the use of foot wraps, an old technique from the early 20th century that predated mass adoption of socks by many people in poor parts of Europe. Among widespread reports of lack of food and water, with some conscripts not eating for days after being rounded up, are reports that new conscripts are forced to sleep on the ground. But these conscripts are lucky because others apparently have no facilities to be held at, resulting in them being dumped into fields with no supplies or equipment. These men are being forced to fend for themselves, with many reports of them stealing pipes and copper wiring to try to sell to locals for cash to buy food, blankets, and other basic necessities. There are widespread reports of conscripts being issued weapons that are thoroughly rusted, though many observers have rightly pointed out that these weapons are merely being used for familiarity training. To date, while some of the weapons used in combat by Russia have certainly seen better days, there's no reports of completely rusted hunks of junk of the type seen in some conscript videos actually making it to the front. The training these conscripts are receiving seems to be severely abbreviated though, at least for some. While some units appear to be receiving the promised weeks of military training, which is still entirely too short for any serious military training, there are many reports of other units being sent almost directly to the front line in Ukraine. Some conscripts have filmed themselves complaining of having fired their weapon once before being sent to the front. The reason is obvious to any observer and a clue to why mobilization simply won't save this war for Russia. Russia's lines are destabilizing and parts of the front are under serious threat of complete collapse. Russia needs bodies in the fight now. It can't afford to wait the standard 6 months it would take a brand new conscript to give them serious military training. So some of these conscripts are being sent directly to the front to try to slow down Ukrainians long enough for better trained units to be mobilized. It's a cold calculus but not uncommon. Using soldiers like cannon fodder is a time-honored tradition in the Russian military that stretches back to the turn of the 20th century. However, when conscripts actually get to the front, morale and discipline is glaringly low.
Вы что, человек в сильнейшем алкогольном опьянении выдали боевое оружие, блядь? Гранаты, может, ему еще...
Russian soldiers in general have a reputation for heavy drinking, even on duty. Famously, an entire artillery unit did not execute a single fire mission during Ukraine's retaking of Lviv because they were all drunk. However, having fresh conscripts show up to the front staggering drunk is a bad sign that you're not fielding quality troops. That appears to be in line with Russia's issuing of poor quality equipment when it can afford to do so. Its helmets have been famously lampooned by Ukrainian forces who are equipped with Western helmets themselves and were shocked to find how cheap Russian helmets were. Their body armor doesn't appear to be much better, with many conscripts being forced to turn to family to buy them real body armor. Family members who buy equipment for their mobilized children or husbands are warned to bring them the equipment themselves, as theft is rampant in the Russian armed forces. Stalin famously said that quantity is a quality all its own, and for most of the Cold War he was absolutely correct. However, Stalin never had to face modern NATO weapons wielded by American-trained Ukrainians thoroughly pissed off about the invasion of their homeland. But while the quality of Russian recruits, their training and equipment is a sign that mobilization is not going to win the war for Putin, his defeat is almost certain due to one single thing: timing. When the war began, Ukraine immediately began its mobilization effort, gradually absorbing hundreds of thousands of new recruits and sending them away for months of training. 6 months after the start of the war, the first waves of these new recruits joined the fighting. Now, while Putin is rushing to send poorly trained conscripts or completely untrained cannon fodder to the front lines, Ukraine is steadily forming new units of conscripts who have undergone half a year of military training. Russia's failure to immediately mobilize for war when it was obvious Kyiv would not fall in April will almost certainly cost it the victory it craves. Now go check out how war in Ukraine will cause Russia to collapse, or click this other video instead.